by W.M. Reddy and Becky in her earlier presentation, after a period of the fastest growing region outside of London, the West Midlands now faces significant economic impact that, without further intervention, may lead to below average growth over the next decade, with a real negative impact on employment and earnings. The primary focus for our plan for growth work was therefore to define a framework through which the region could activate and amplify job creation above those forecast levels. This meant identifying areas where the West Midlands has competitive or comparative advantage and where there's evidence of market confidence in order to develop a credible path for positive, sustainable growth. Sustainable growth builds upon our region's strong heritage and champions an inclusive economy to deliver greener growth. It protects, it evolves, and it creates opportunity. To deliver this, the Plan for Growth framework as presented takes a cluster-based approach. It proposes two strands. Firstly, capitalising on primary clusters, clusters of scale and strength for additional growth in the short to medium term, and concurrently supporting nascent clusters and emerging technologies to drive the next horizons of growth. 8 primary clusters were identified, which through a series of targeted complementary interventions could deliver significant growth for the region to be around the UK average by 2030. So working with the Combined Authority and its partners, including the Growth Company and the LEPs as already acknowledged, a portfolio of potential nascent clusters were also identified. To be the fastest growing region outside of London, these emerging opportunities would need to deliver an extra 0.75 to 1 billion of GVA. So we're now going to talk you through our approach to identifying those key growth opportunities and also the initiatives upon which these opportunities should be able to be realised to deliver upon the regional plan for growth. Over to Peter.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I think this slide is really helpful because it arcs back to what Rebecca was talking about earlier. But what we first wanted to do was define what we saw as the challenge. So very conscious this is quite a busy slide, but you've got 4 lines here that path out growth trajectories. So the yellow line is the current West Midlands forecast from now 2022 through to 2030. The grey line is what GVA would look like in the West Midlands if it matched the UK average. The blue line as if it was matching the fastest UK region outside of London, which the West Midlands was in the preceding decade. And finally, the green line is the growth trajectory of London, which is the fastest growing region in the UK economy. And what this highlights is that there's a growth gap. So a 3.9 billion growth gap by 2030 would need to be overcome to make the West Midlands as the fastest growing region outside of London. Now, if we want to match London's growth trajectory, that would require an extra 6.7 billion of GVA. So that is, if you like, the challenge we were looking to address. And how did we approach it? Well, so as Sarah alluded to, we thought of this in 2 elements. So firstly, to get the region up to the UK average, and in fact, just a little bit ahead of UK average, the focus was on looking at existing clusters, what we call primary clusters, where the region had comparative advantage, and thinking through the sort of specific interventions that could be put in place to drive economic growth, as Councillor Brookfield said, now in the next 2 to 5 years, so to get that moving quickly. And through the combination of our analysis, we felt that you could achieve around 2 billion of that directly by direct intervention in those primary clusters, and that would have a wider benefit of additional billion via supply chain and wider multiplier effects. And that would give you around 3 billion of additional growth between 40 to 44,000 jobs and get you above that UK average. And then to go on to target to be best performing region, we propose a slightly different strategy. So here really thinking around new emerging sectors, which will deliver the growth of the future, perhaps over a longer time frame, and with the acceptance that you need to back a few more horses, a few more areas to seed some new sectors to deliver growth in the longer period. And as Sarah mentioned, we divided that target into 2. So to get you to being the best performing region outside of London, you need an additional 750 to 1 billion of GVA. But to match London, we're looking at another 3 billion of GVA. So if I focus then on how we determine the primary clusters, we really look to understand the comparative advantage of the West Midlands. So just explaining on this diagram, the x-axis, so the horizontal axis looks at the regional strength, so the kind of comparative advantages currently existing in the region. The x-axis looks at what we consider to be growth potential, taken on an external view of the market, where we saw their growth opportunities. The size of the bubble was the size of the sector currently expressed in GVA terms in the region, And then the colour of the bubble really reflects the kind of the contribution to the value add of the sector, so the relative wages compared. And you can see that we identified 8 sectors where we thought there was an opportunity to sort of double down investment and accelerate growth. And those range from the traditional strengths in manufacturing of automotive and that transition to electric vehicles, in logistics and distribution, perhaps taking advantage of the shift to the online economy and some of the challenges that Brexit will bring around global trade. Professional and financial services, already a large sector and a highly value add sector, and then perhaps some of the sort of more nascent sectors even now. So creative content production and gaming, still relatively small, but we think it has a high opportunity to grow. So that was how we defined our primary clusters. And then thinking around the strategy we're adopting in terms of accelerating growth in those 2 views, so one on primary and one around nascent. So with primary, it's very much understanding existing regional strengths where there's already a strong jobs base and a strong industrial base, and then really thinking through the barriers and the enablers for growth, so what they may be, and that would inform our focus on developing a set of interventions to unlock and accelerate that growth. And then, as I mentioned previously, when we're talking about targeting that best performing region, a focus on nascent clusters. And here really we undertook a review of emerging technologies where there's some existing capability in the region, but perhaps just at the very early stages, or some trends that we think the region could take advantage of. So bringing about how we can target those, placing some long-term investments across a number of different areas with recognition that not all of those will pay back, but with the intention of driving faster growth in the longer term. And again, then thinking about what are the barriers, what are the kind of enablers you need to really seed those? How do you go from startup to scale up? How do you seed new clusters and new areas? And recognizing the importance of R&D, which is again something we discussed earlier on the call, but also something that I note in the release around the white paper has been flagged as a key focus area for the levelling up agenda. Yeah. So I think I was going to hand back over to Sarah to just go into a little bit more detail around the clusters themselves, the interventions, and how we bring it all together.
Thank you, Peter. So what were the clusters? This slide summarises the key features of the clusters, their role within the plan for growth, and the nature of the interventions that we believe are required to really unlock their potential. We believe that both sets of clusters demonstrate paths for credible growth, but in very different ways. So we're going to talk you through first the primary clusters and the interventions that underpin them. To identify the optimal interventions, we drew upon domestic and international experience to develop a drivers for growth framework. We sought to find interventions that accelerated and amplified the conditions for growth, giving consideration to infrastructure and physical capital, the human capital, the social capital, and the investment or the institutional capital. This meant finding interventions which leveraged existing competitive advantage to accelerate opportunities and accelerate activities through the enablers and removing barriers. Our regional analysis and our experience of the WMCA and their partners allowed us to conclude that really there are some common needs and barriers across clusters. This means that some interventions are likely to have a compounding positive impact if they're implemented effectively and could be structured across a number of clusters rather than mapping one for one. The interventions that we identified are broadly four categories: those which drive outcomes through the public policy framework, through organisational coordination levers, or those associated with funding and financing. The next slide sets out those potential interventions which address the barriers to growth across multiple clusters. I think it's timely to recognise that in preparing our work, we recognise that these initiatives and clusters don't represent the whole economy, and neither were they intended to with the objective that we sought to achieve, and that due to the diversity of our region, not all communities will benefit at the same time in the same way from these initiatives. However, they have been created in line with the intent to positively impact the whole region. They promote alignment amongst partners and across the supply chain to better meet businesses' needs. They support new delivery models, which provide scalable investment opportunities and evergreen financing solutions. We believe that if delivered effectively, they'll create the size, pipeline and commitment required to optimise market opportunity across the West Midlands. So here's the numbers of what it might look like if these initiatives are all done together. We don't propose to talk through all of these in this summary today, but they are available in your pack. So if we look at the next slide, which is the nascent or emerging opportunities, these are the second strand of the Plan for Growth framework. They are inherently riskier than the primary clusters, and they're smaller in size, but we believe there's a real appetite and alignment with regional priorities, such as those providing support now might lead to significant growth in the future. The strategy here and the initiatives are more strategic in nature. They're intended to provide access to funding or financing to seed capital, in attracting and developing necessary skills through R&D, and championing the clusters to help them mature. Again, we're not intending to talk through all of the detail of the numbers in this presentation, but what you can see is how they might actually support the two areas that Peter referred to, helping us get to the fastest growing UK region and then meeting London and the required additional jobs in terms of both GVA and in terms of growth. Which brings us to a point that Matt mentioned earlier and how we bring it all together. Yes, please. And it brings us towards the end of our summary, but by no means the end of the Plan for Growth journey. In fact, with the announcements this morning, it marks the start of a very exciting chapter, as many of the themes that you've seen in clusters align nicely to the intent and the levelling up white paper themes. It starts with a series of activities to integrate and activate the framework and join it up with other parts of the regional vision. And so in conclusion, we've identified a package of cluster-specific and cross-cutting interventions that are targeted at the existing or primary clusters that we believe will bring growth to the West Midlands to just ahead of the UK average by 2030, and a focus on emerging clusters through the provision of seed funding and early stage support, which we believe will help bridge the gap to become a faster growing region. The next steps are set out in this slide, and it leaves us only with a chance to thank everybody that's contributed towards this, the partnership across the combined authority and also the members within the organisation to identify areas where our region can accelerate and amplify positive sustainable growth.